You are listening to a podcast created by the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Our mission is to help you understand your world better through geography. The topic of this podcast addresses the notion of geographic region. In this case, it is a region illustrated by the Minnesota Iron Range example. Some devices accessing this podcast will be able to show pictures, chapters, and clickable links. Several Minnesota geography standards are addressed in this podcast. Our presenter is Master Teacher Craig Haddam. Craig teaches 8th grade geography at Hibbing High School. He is currently and has been a Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education Steering Committee member and a presenter at a variety of geography workshops for many years. Craig served on the Minnesota Council for Social Studies Board from 1989 to 2005. He was voted Hibbing Public School Teacher of the Year in 2010. His professional goal is to have a paperless classroom by 2015. I am Fred Kunze, a member of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Craig, a region is a fundamental concept in geography.
Yes, it is.
But it's not always easy to understand how geographers think about a region. So here today, you have some kind of a definition for us and some examples to round out that concept for us.
When I teach about regions to my students, I give them 3 kinds of regions. I have a political region, and on the podcast, if you're able to look at the picture, I have an outline map of the United States and Canada, the different states and provinces, and that's an example of what I like to call a political region. We can see a line, we can draw that line, we know where it is, other places have agreed to it. And then the second kind I always like to tell students about is the social region. It's the kind of region that you have in your head, like where it's the safe place to ride your bike, what you think makes up your neighborhood, where is the best fishing holes on the lake. Those are regions you kind of put in your head. And I think sometimes adults also have regions in their head where it's safe for their kids to play. And those kinds of things are social regions. They're more stuff that you've kind of put together from your own experience and knowledge and going through life. And then I like to tell my students about scientific regions. These are regions that geographers have made up. We as adults would think of market regions. Geographers know through their study what kind of market area is going in, how big a market area is. They've checked to see what kind of customers are in the area, where they're shopping. The ones that most often I've enjoyed online lately is the ones where they've used Facebook data and they've aggregated this data to create like the Twins fan area, the Timberwolves fan area. And the one I have on the map for you is one that's NBA teams. That some people at the New York Times did, and they aggregated a bunch of Facebook data and information and came up with this wonderful map of where each NBA team most of its fans are located. The social region one I told you about a moment ago has a map, and that map is about the Midwest. They asked people, well, where is the Midwest? Which states make up the Midwest? Now, you can't define that. You can't come up with a really good definition. It's more where people think it is. But when you see the map, people have pointed places as far away as Utah and Pennsylvania and think they're part of the Midwest. So the definition of the Midwest, we would have to come up with something that defines the Midwest, because everybody kind of has their own idea of it to begin with. Maybe it's the old Corn Belt, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's some other thing that people want to agree to as a definition. So when I look at the Iron Range, and when you look at the podcast, if you get the chance, I gave a picture of this. There's a graphic showing the old iron ore formations that were in the ground that people found in the late 1800s that became the Iron Range. And that original mining region was about 110 miles long. It kind of makes a jag right around the Virginia White Lakes area and goes up towards Ely. But there were 3 iron ranges at one time. 2 of them were basically for underground. The Cuyuna and the Vermilion Iron Ranges were mostly for underground mining, but the Mesabi Range, the one where I live near Hibbing, the Mesabi Range has open pit iron ore mining, and that open pit iron ore mining is a unique feature to Minnesota in terms of the length and the size of that iron range. There are only a couple other iron ranges in the whole world that have had as much iron ore as those. So I think when you're on the Iron Range, the two things that people note that kind of give you the physical geography of where this Iron Range is, and I have pictures of those that would appear on the podcast if you can see them, but I'll describe them for you. One is a mining dump. It's a big hill where they have moved a lot of dirt out of the way to get to the actual iron ore. And they are sometimes very, very tall, a couple 100 feet in the air. And people who visit the area often wonder how these hills or these mountains appeared there. And we move the dirt out of the way to do that. In some parts of the country, they're called tip heaps because you back up your truck and you tip up the bucket and it dumps out all the ore. Some of the highest places in Minnesota now, because the Mesabi Iron Range is on a relatively high spot, they've built up some of these areas with tip heaps on them. And there's a tip heap that's kind of north and maybe a little west of Chisholm that I think is probably near one of the highest spots in Minnesota if you could go back and look at the elevation of it now, because they're quite tall, they're quite large. The other one is the actual mining pit itself. A lot of the mining pits in the Iron Range now are filled with water, but I gave you a picture, very current picture, of the Hull Rust pit just north of Hibbing, and the water is out of it. They're mining it. They're able to sell this iron ore to other parts around the world. And I think those two things give you a very strict definition, strict social definition in a way, of where the Iron Range is. It's where you can see the mining dumps and where you can see the mining pits, whether they're filled with water or whether they're active mines and they're mining them for the moment. Side note about that, Fred, is the water fills up because they're mining below the water table. So when they're mining in places right now, they're mining below the water table, and they have to pump out all that water somewhere else. So that's a real strict definition about it. But to add to what I think makes up the Iron Range is I have a graph. There's some other things that go into the people who came to work on the Iron Range came at a time when people who were coming to the United States were mostly from southeastern Europe. They are from Italy and what we now call Croatia and Slovenia and Slovakia and Serbia. Lots of those people were coming into the country at the time. So where most of Minnesota has the Scandinavian or the German background to talk about it, a lot of Iron Rangers, and myself included, have a lot of Italian or something that we would call Yugoslavian in their system. And then to add to it is the whole part that the Finns were coming to the United States at the same time. Now, you and I think of them as being Scandinavian, but in the early days of the Iron Range, the Norwegians and the Swedes kind of looked down on the Finns and thought of them as a different group of people. And so I speak like a Minnesotan most of the time, but I also have parts of me that speak differently than the rest of. There's no yassers or you betchas that come out of me. I can give you a good duh once in a while, but my line of always determine which part of Minnesota you're from is how you say there. You have that room that some people have in their house, or sometimes it's down by their lake where they've made a shack, and inside there they pour water on hot rocks and make it steam.
We call that a sauna.
In the Twin Cities, you call it a sauna. Up north, I call it a sauna. So it's two very different ways. You have like the word saw in it, and I have sow in it for some reason. And that's a little bit of the difference. And there are good maps out there that show you linguistic regions. I have a linguistic region map that I found. It's called like the American English Dialect or something like that. Great website. And the guy has done a lot of research and added a lot of what other people have put in there. And right in the map I took from there, and I've given for the podcast, shows the Iron Ranges with their own separate area inside of it, and Hibbing's inside that area, and so we have a slightly different linguistic way of saying things. For example, instead of Hibbing, I said Hibbing, and I don't catch myself until I stop and think about it once in a while. So lots of great things. There's a joke book up in the north. You can buy it in some bookstores still. It's How to Talk Ranger. And they spell it the way we say it. And so there's all sorts of things that are really cute about it. Big discussion about my friends right now is how you say crayon or crayon, and which way you say it. And it's kind of an interesting discussion. And I come from the part of the state that still calls a carbonated soda a pop. I don't call it a soda, I call it a pop, a carbonated beverage. So those are one of the other things. So there are some language differences, there's some ethnic differences. There are also, these ethnicities brought some food. I gave you a picture of a pasty. And a pasty, really on the UP of Michigan first, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, I should explain what UP is. And these English miners would bring with them, they would have potatoes and vegetables inside dough that would be cooked up, and they would bring it into the mines with them, and they would eat that cooked up, wrapped in vegetables, wrapped in dough for lunch, or their meal for the day. And that came to the Iron Range, and so there are various different kinds of pasties. The other one I think most people find unusual when they're on the Iron Range is porchetta. And porchetta is pork with a lot of fennel and other spices in it, and it's wrapped up and it's cooked for a real long time. And when it's cut, it breaks up into little pieces, and it's almost shredded in a way when you cut it. And every town up there has their own favorite version of their local porchetta. For example, in Hibbing, Ferboni's Meats sells their version of porchetta, and I gave you a picture. I have a friend, Tom Pascuzzi. He helps run Jubilee grocery store in Chisholm, and he has a porchetta that over in Chisholm people will tell you is their favorite porchetta over there. So it's an example again of the things that make it an Iron Range. So really those are the things I wanted to mention a little bit about range. The one last thing I gave you as to help define what part of the state of Minnesota that's in, is there is a place, in 1964, Minnesota passed a new state amendment to change the way that iron ore manufacturing, and specifically taconite, was manufactured. Before 1964, you could tax the iron mining industry on the value of the ore in the ground. After 1964, when they passed the taconite tax amendment, it was based upon the tons of iron ore that were taken out of the ground. It was a tonnage tax. And that tax, much of that money goes to the area of the Iron Range and the counties on the Iron Range for either property tax relief or to help the schools. Those are really the two biggest things. Many of the teachers would recognize what used to be called the IRRB, Iron Range Resources, we call it today the IRR. And that map I threw in as a way of saying somewhere inside this area you can kind of label the Iron Range, because it includes most of northeastern Minnesota, because some of the Cuyuna is still in there, Aiken is still in part of that area, and so is Ely. But much of the taconite production now is all in what we think of the Mesabi Iron Range. And so those are some of the things I think that add up to say you can look and find some ways to define the Iron Range as a region, both politically, using the taconite tax assistance, socially, by, if you want to look at the way the people, the foods they eat and the way they speak. And you can do it scientifically by looking at where these ethnic groups moved into in Minnesota and where they chose to live. There are only a few places in Minnesota where a lot of Italians settled, and you have the west side of Duluth, you have the Iron Range, parts of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and there are one or two other places, but really. In the 1920s, the Italians were located in just those couple places. And so you can define the Iron Range as a region that way. And I think it's a really good way to start to look at for teachers to start to look what would define their region in their area. Whether it be talking to their students about looking at a map of their community or their school area and saying, where is your neighborhood in this? Or does it all make up your neighborhood? How do you know where your neighborhood ends and begins? Is a nice way to start to talk about kids about social region.
You have been listening to a production of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Background music is courtesy of Jim Hogue of Decorah, Iowa. The Minnesota Alliance is a non-profit group of educators and other parties who are interested in promoting an enhanced understanding of our world through improved geographic literacy.